Okay, so cool. Okay, so this is going to be kind of a narrow view at an idea that exists within posthumanism. So I'm just going to begin. In how we became posthuman, virtual bodies and cybernetics, literature and informatics, Catherine Hales doesn't really muse whether the posthuman will come, but rather, what are we to make of the posthumans that we already are? Hales explores the positive and negative implications of the potential of the posthuman and where potential evolutions might carry it. Hales and other researchers also acknowledge that depending on your perspective, the prospect of becoming posthuman both evokes terror and excites pleasure. Fear of the posthuman, as Hales points out, is pretty easy to understand with its dual connotations of superseding the human and coming after it, hinting that the days of the human are numbered. And yes, this conception of the posthuman as something anti-human is understandable. The body of literature that extols fears of humanity threatened by heartless AI, subsumed into sinister cyborgs, trapped in virtual realities, or chased down by really buff killer robots is boundless. The concern that human beings will misuse and abuse our technologies to sinister ends don't seem entirely unfounded. But when I sat down to write this, I unplugged my digital hearing aid and set wireless headphones into the conclaves of my ears, connecting them to my smartphone to stream music from the internet as I typed into a word processor to marshal my thoughts to be relayed to you through the internet. I think it could be argued that my conception of myself has already been pushed away from the purity of my human state as defined by liberal humanism and towards what Hales and Donna Haraway and what other posthumanist theorists might describe as a distributed cognition. I acknowledge I am among those for whom the posthuman evokes the exhilarating prospect of opening up new ways of thinking and what being human means. It's important to note, for me, a distinction between post and transhumanism. Where transhumanism might seek more literal fusions of the human and the machine, the type of the posthuman that I am discussing is more conceptual, where both philosophies might imply the image of the cyborg, what Hales defines as human-machine symbiosis. The transformation of the posthuman doesn't necessarily require the, quote, intrusion of silicone and wires into flesh and blood, according to Andy Clark, author of Natural Born Cyborgs, but instead any fusion between the pure human and the use of artifice that humans might use to express themselves or enable their identities, as anyone who has felt themselves thinking via the act of writing already knows. The critical project of posthumanism is not the end of humanity or human life, but again, perhaps the end of the conception of the human, which has dominated the way that especially Western countries have thought about what it means to be human for quite a long time. So Hales and I think I would argue that the danger doesn't necessarily come from the posthuman itself, but from grafting the posthuman onto a liberal humanist view of the self. But for that, I have to explain, although I'm sure the people on this panel might already know, what liberal humanism might be. So liberal humanism can be traced back to the Enlightenment era of the 18th century and onwards, approximately, encompassing many of the philosophical and political ideologies that were created and elaborated on well into the 20th and 21st century. Though full of contradictions and not a fixed idea of any one thinker, meaning that what I'm saying does not necessarily contradict all liberal humanism, there's a lot of it. The main project of liberal humanism, as many posthumanists see it, could be to entirely center the universe around the notion of the human, not necessarily the sun revolving around the earth, but the universe revolving around us. This dismisses any suggestion that history, ethics, identity, or even reality could extend beyond what you might call a pure human subjectivity. Liberal humanism separates the human and places it above all else, and therefore essential to liberal humanism, or at least this conception of it, is the idea of an other. If liberal humanism is a promotion of the desire for mastery over the world and each other, an objectivist account of science, and the imperialist project of subduing nature, as Hales would argue, then it is wrapped up in the idea of empire and subjugation and colonialism. Hales argues that the main promoters of liberal humanism tend to be those who have the wealth, power, and leisure to conceptualize themselves as autonomous beings, exercising their free will through individual agency and choice. I think it's also important to note the qualifications that this worldview puts on those who choose to be human. The idea that judgment is a uniquely human function suggests that a human whose ability to perform this function works differently than the accepted norm. That a human whose ability to perform judgment differently than the accepted norm might not be entirely accepted as human. I think the argument for Platonic rational human subjectivity suggests that those suffering from mental illness or living with disability have been made less human as a result. In her article, Posthuman Humanities, Rosie Berdotti argued that for the liberal humanist subjectivity is equated with consciousness. Did I go too far? Nah. Universal rationality and self-regulating ethical behavior, all of them equating masculinity and European civilization, whereas otherness is defined as its negative and specular counterpart, irrationality, immorality, femininity, and non-Westernness. While problematic, we should not necessarily be surprised that the image of a perfect human subjectivity in Western liberal humanism is modeled after the people arguing for its existence, precluding all others. Donna Haraway argued that the creation of the us-other binary is a manic compulsion to name the enemy. And I think it's important to understand that when someone is othered, that othering is always a kind of violence. There is, of course, a gendered aspect to all this, as well as the image of this ideal human, as stated by Berdotti, is coincidentally male. So, I scrolled too far. So, if one is coming from such a conception of the world, I think it's very easy to understand why the prospect of the posthuman, or even the suggestion of it, is terrifying. If your entire philosophy is organized around the ethical imperative that humans keep control, then of course imagining a world where control has been lost or ceded to beings you consider anti or non-human in any way would be awful. But in the posthuman view, by contrast, conscious agency of the human subject has never really been in control. The liberal humanist manifest destiny to dominate and control nature has only ever been an illusion. We are not in control, something that I think in this moment of pandemic, when I don't know when to put on pants and go outside and go back to sleep, no matter when the sun is out, feels truer than ever. Even view of things in our culture classified as natural, both in the human and non-human worlds, are not necessarily true, but viewpoints being imposed onto nature, often because the liberal humanist vocabulary is one of the simplicity of one other and natural unnatural. As I can't really pronounce this name, but it's Fritos Capra, author of a book called The Tao of Physics, states, the natural world is one of infinite varieties and complexities, where things don't necessarily happen in sequence, but all together, whether we like it or not. If we're to account for most actual living things, for example, plant life and microbes that we can never see, then the myth of heterosexuality as natural, for example, is supplanted by the truth that not only is homosexuality absolutely abundant in nature and lots of fun, but most life on Earth reproduces asexually. In his article, Queer Ecology, theorist Timothy Morton argues that nature looks natural only because it keeps going and going and going like the undead, and because we keep looking away, framing it and sizing it up, and refusing to see when it doesn't fit within the rules we have set down for it. Hales, too, speaks a lot about chaos or randomness as a key feature of both nature and human subjectivity, citing theories who see randomness not simply as a lack of pattern, but as the creative ground on which patterns can emerge. Patterns and randomness and chaos are the building blocks of nature and a creature's subjectivity. And here I use subjectivity to refer to how a creature sees the world and how that being sees and defines itself as a part of the world, to be aware / self-aware or conscious as the central deconstruction of liberal humanism under posthumanist thought. One of the ways posthumanism offers a resource for rethinking articulations of humans and intelligent machines as not apocalyptic or anti-human, by rethinking how we might signify the human. If we accept the posthumanist argument that we are not necessarily a beings of autonomous will with the power to judge that this is unique to humans, and that we are instead that we are not quote, stable, coherent selves, but only autonomous agents running programs, then I think we